We at the Lyft Economy team have some exciting news to share. We have just launched a brand new second podcast called Beyond the B, and we're cross-posting the first episode of Beyond the B here on this channel. If you follow the B Corp movement at all, you may know the movement is at a bit of a crossroads. While the B Corp community continues to grow, there have been tensions inside and outside of the movement around a variety of topics. What tensions? What topics, you might ask? Well, dear friend, you'll have to listen to the following episode to learn more. And if you like what you hear, we invite you to subscribe to Beyond the B on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So without further ado, here's the first episode of Beyond the B.
Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of Beyond the B, where Emmy Allison and I, Ryan Honeyman, talk about the B Corp movement, and we deep dive into the good and also some of the bad, some of the constructive side of the B Corp movement. I can briefly introduce myself. I'm Ryan Honeyman. I'm a partner and worker owner at Lyft Economy. Have been a B Corp nerd since 2011 or 2012. First certified my company, Honeyman Sustainability Consulting, in 2012, and have been pretty heavily involved in the B Corp movement since then, helping companies certify and recertify as B Corps. And I'm the author of the original B Corp handbook in 2014 and co-authored the B Corp handbook with Dr. Tiffany Jana in 2019. And very excited to have my colleague Emmy, who's also a fellow B Corp geek, to talk about all things B Corp. Emmy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, howdy. I'm Emmy Allison. My pronouns are she, her. I work at Lyft Economy. I think my title is technically Impact Advisor or something like that. But I almost exclusively support companies going through the B Corp certification process, both for initial cert and recertification. Before Lyft Economy, I was at B Lab US and Canada. I was supporting the B Corp community with recertification in the US and Canada. I technically have been a B Corp nerd since 2013, when my former partner Nicole Kodiker and I started 4C Consulting, and we took quite a few companies through the impact assessment between our consulting services and then also a couple of B Corp clinics that we ran at Drexel University. But throughout my career, I sort of have always kept responsible business in mind, whether it be through workforce development and economic inclusion work at Drexel University to some of the fun super philanthropy like impact investing and regenerative agriculture when I was working for Tom Steyer and Kat Taylor. So I've seen a really interesting variety of perspectives of the B Corp movement for the past 10 years, which is wild.
Yeah. It's funny, I actually, for a moment, forgot that you and Nicole had done the Drexel program.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So much fun.
I feel like Nicole is an honorary B Corp nerd as well.
Oh,
even
truly.
Though, is she still involved in this space?
Yeah, she's actually at Council Fire, which is
okay, that's right.
A B Corp based in Annapolis, Maryland. But we're neighbors. We live like half a mile away from each other, which is lovely.
Awesome. Well, folks may wonder, why are we doing this podcast and what's it all about? So for folks who are wondering, the idea behind this podcast, Emmy and I have been talking about this for a while. We basically want to provide an expert, credible, yet independent voice in the B Corp community that understands the movement, can speak about what is working and not working, and can be a brave space to address difficult topics. So if you've been following the B Corp world over the past couple years, I would say since I originally joined in 2011 or so until probably 2020, maybe, it was largely only positive media attention and positive things about the B Corp world. It was like, this is so amazing. Robert Schiller from, former Nobel laureate was like, B Corps and benefit corps will make more money than other types of companies. You had like Madeleine Albright. You had Bill Clinton talking about B Corps. This was like pre-2016 Bill Clinton, I feel like. Yeah. And before Bill Clinton became more controversial on the left. And then you had Patagonia and Ben & Jerry's and King Arthur Flour and Method and all these. It was just all positive love and vibes, mostly. I mean, not all. And then if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a fellow nerd like me and Emmy. The last couple of years have been kind of rough with negative publicity, like a Wall Street Journal article that came out. There was a BBC article. There was several B Corps basically having labor like there was a B Corp, Amy's Kitchen, had a labor violation that got a lot of negative attention. You had Nespresso getting certified, which was pretty controversial, is still controversial. There was a pub I think in the UK called Brewdog that had a toxic workplace culture, but was a B Corp. So all of a sudden there was a lot of negative publicity about the B Corp movement. And part of what Emmy and I have talked about is that there hasn't been a place to really have those conversations in a public way that's transparent. It's more just sort of like emailing and texting random people like, hey, do you see this? How bad is this? I don't know. And so I think part of this is to bring that to light. And Emmy, do you have more thoughts to add on that?
I will say the identity of the movement seems to have shifted to mean more things to more people. And I think this inherently just creates some discord in general. There are all of these examples of sort of non-values aligned things that have happened or things that companies in the community that have been responsible for. But I will also say, as we create a safe space to talk about these things and to process these things, I think that we, Ryan and I, are really mindful about how we can talk about these issues in a constructive manner and in a way that, it just feels like we're a little bit less alone or a little bit less worried or a little bit less questioning sort of why are we here and why are we doing this? I think it helps to sort of air some of these things out and bring light to some of these things.
Yeah, you said something really important that I want to emphasize is that Emmy and I are not here to bitch about the B Corp movement, like how terrible it is.
Right.
Like the idea is constructive, real talk that can be critical, but is not meant to tear it down in a juvenile or like a manner that's meant to just be backbiting and like, oh, did you hear about how terrible this is? Or, it's like, hey, there's some pretty critical articles coming out and they're raising some really big questions and we should probably talk about this.
Some really valid questions.
Yeah, really valid questions. And so I think part of what we want to do over the coming weeks is both talk about the B Corp world, help you explore sustainable business practices, educate some of the listeners on the new B Corp standards that are coming out, and also bring on guests that are experts and are also similarly committed to building a better B Corp movement, but also may have critiques that are worth discussing on the show. So some of the topics, just to give folks an example, is things like Nespresso, multinationals, the new standards. In the new standards, there's things like stakeholder mapping. Emmy and I are going to talk briefly today about greenwashing and performative sustainability and, some other things that we've talked about or will talk about in the future, like what are these negative news articles coming out about the movement. So just to give folks a little bit of a teaser as to what may be coming, and just The other quick things I'll say is the length of the show is probably ideally around 45 minutes, 60 minutes plus or minus, and then twice per month. So some of you may know we already have something called the Next Economy Now podcast, where we interview leaders across the board. It's whether it's racial justice advocates, it can be B Corp CEOs, it can be just next economy type companies. Next economy is our way of describing the economy that needs to be created in order to get us to a world that works for the benefit of all life. And so it's a little less inside baseball on the B Corp movement. And so this is more of the inside baseball version of the B Corp podcast. Anything coming up for you?
Yeah, I think this is also a fun podcast because we do get to get a little bit technical because our audience is very much folks who are in the B Corp community, or at least extremely familiar with B Corp certification and all that is required to achieve and maintain this certification. So I also look forward to getting into the nitty gritty a little bit and adding context to some of the issues that we have in our list here.
Yeah, and we want to make this show sort of ongoing dialogue with folks. So if you're interested, we'd love to get your questions about things you'd like us to talk about. You can email us at beyond@lifteconomy.com. And so that's a Beyond the B. We just go to beyond@lifteconomy.com and request whatever topics you want us to get into, because we're very interested in this being relevant to you and your work in the B Corp world. And, last thing I would say is we hope that this can also be a space for B Lab staff. Again, not to have a place where it's like, let me just complain about these things that aren't happening or should be happening. But it's like, we want to be able to create a space where B Lab employees can voice what they're seeing. And, for example, one thing I'm trying to do is get some of the leaders of B Lab to come on the show and have a conversation with, for example, David Bronner from Dr. Bronner's, who's had some pretty strong critiques of the B Corp movement, and especially as it relates to Nespresso, and why we would allow Nestle to come into the community, even though I did point out to David that technically Nestle has had a few subsidiaries, like Garden of Life is, I guess, owned by Nestle since 2017. So there have been some B Corps owned by Nestle for a while, but Nespresso and the coffee pods, it just grates people, I think, to think about coffee pods being in the community. But yeah, maybe that's a good jumping off point, Amy, to talk about greenwashing and performative sustainability.
Yeah, and without getting too deep in the weeds of any particular sort of area or topic, I do think Nespresso is an interesting starting point because, again, without getting too in the weeds, what Nespresso, a company of Nespresso's size, has to go through to get B Corp certified is no small feat. And I think that the premise of these sort of aluminum coffee pods, which I will be honest, I have had and enjoyed in my life.
Oh,
and also,
how dare you?
And also I have seen sort of people I trust to make responsible decisions have these machines in their homes. I'm not going to put anyone on blast right now, but I think it's the idea that it's a single-use item that folks really have a hard time wrapping their brains around and doesn't feel sort of B Corp aligned. But I don't think it's substantially different from, we have companies in the movement that are selling single-use items across the community. It's like compostable cups and compostable napkins, paper towels, toilet paper. I think that it's a bit unfair to just all of a sudden be so frustrated with a company like Nespresso. And then, yeah, kind of what I started with is some folks might not truly understand the lengths that these larger companies have to go through when you have a public parent company, or when you're public yourself and you're over a certain amount of revenue and over a certain amount of employees, your review gets longer and longer and longer. Your review gets more and more rigorous. I think it's something like if you had a B Corp with no sort of, I forget what the terminology they use is, like no risk factors or something like that. Your review will be mostly your impact business models. So we'll ask some fundamental questions about your business models, and then they'll select something like maybe not even 10% of your impact assessment to verify. But the larger you get, again, both by revenue and by employee size, and then when you have public companies involved, more and more and more of your assessment is selected for a review. 20, 30, 40, 50% of your assessment is selected for review, and that's where an analyst is really raking through your documentation to ensure that it meets B Lab standards. And so while we might be really frustrated at the idea of this single-use product in our community, and I don't even know anything about the machines, like, are they using recycled plastic for these machines? Probably not. I don't know. It is a lot harder for a company like Nespresso to be certified.
Yeah. And I think it's worth maybe even for folks who don't know, just talking about just the general tension in the movement about who should be in and who should be out. Like that's always been a big part of, so, the B Corp movement obviously started with this goal of how do we separate good companies from good marketing? Like that was B Lab's marketing for talking about the B Corp movement. And I remember the first B Corp retreat I went to was in Half Moon Bay in California, and 2012, and it was the same. That retreat was when Ben & Jerry's got certified, and that was pretty controversial, obviously, because Ben & Jerry's is owned by Unilever, although who knows who it's going to be owned by in a couple months. So the whole tension of like who should be in and who should be out has been part of the movement for many years. And I think that's even one of the founding ideas of B Corp certification, is that in the past, it was just whoever's like corporate reputation and like whatever enough people think is like good or bad, that was sort of how a company was classified. So it's like if a ton of people think Patagonia is quote unquote like sustainable or very regenerative, it didn't even matter really what their independent score might be on an assessment. It would just be like they're a good company. And then it would similarly, it might be for Walmart or someone else, or maybe using another clothing company like North Face. It might be, oh well, they're owned by VF Corporation and like they're not sustainable, but it was just someone's opinion as to like what they were or were not. And so the B Corp idea was like, let's take people's opinions out of it and make it credible third-party standards. So you could apply that to an espresso and say, hey, if they've met the third-party standard, they should go through. I think the big however, and that the people have rightly pushed back about, is that are the standards working if Nespresso makes it through? Because people feel so vehemently, strongly that, first of all, like just coffee pods in general, and then second of all, like owned by Nestle, which famously was pretty horrible with marketing breast milk substitutes.
And has had accusations of child labor in its supply chain. Yeah.
Yes. And so I think if you are growing a movement in a big tent philosophy, you're always going to have people who believe we're the most progressive, we're the most high scoring, and we want to keep those companies who we want to be differentiated from out of the community. And then you're going to have another subset of the community that's like, well, we can't just have 100 B Corps that are all scoring like 150 points or higher, and yet we have no impact because we're such a small community. So we need companies like Nespresso and Unilever or whatever. And so I think the Nespresso thing is just more of like a recent flare-up of the same tension that's been in the whole B Corp community since the start in many ways. What do you think about that, Emmy?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And yes, the tension exists. And just for a long time, I think we've been asking, does it make sense to try to incentivize businesses of all sizes to join the community so that improvement can really be encouraged and celebrated? Or is it something where folks have to have all of their ducks in a row by the time that they apply, and they need to make sure that they stay on top of it for the duration of, certification, but ideally the lives of the companies overall. But I think the B Corp movement has really stressed improvement up to this point. And I think it has been a somewhat inclusive approach to say the bar is 80 points and there's always room for you to improve your company operations. You can introduce new business models. There are ways for you to, quote, increase your score. But on the other hand of the sort of points earning model has been identified as also inequitable. There are companies with disadvantages, whether they be their size or their ownership, that face significantly more obstacles than multinational corporations. And so therefore, the number of points that you get might not really truly correlate with your impact if you're not getting the help that you need to translate your impact to the impact assessment, to hire folks like us at Lyft Economy to support them through that process. And so it's very interesting that in the evolution of standards that B Lab is considering doing away with the points. But yes, in terms of greenwashing, I think the B Corp certification has really helped to truly differentiate those who are putting sort of their money where their mouth is, or their time, because their time and money is very truly heavily involved in this. But it feels a bit unfair to me a lot of times for B Corp to be the main differentiator. It's a bit black and white way to think about corporate responsibility.
It is. And I think that was what the founders had hoped for, right? Is like, you just need this B logo on your product or service and you're different. So it has been marketed that way. But yeah, I think, it might be worth talking about how these different sort of pain points or tensions all intersect with each other in the B Corp world. So we've got performative sustainability and greenwashing, and this tension of like who's in or who's out, or like who should be in and who should be out. And there's differing opinions. There's no quote unquote 100% correct answer. There's just opinions. So that's one tension in the movement. Another tension in the movement is the new standards, which are coming out. The final version should be the end of 2024. And then companies will be starting to be tested against them in 2025, mid 25. And there's a lot of confusion and, a lot of fear about, am I going to get left out with these new standards? And similarly, I've heard from David Bronner and others that are the standards actually tough enough? Like, are they going to let people in? So again, there's two sides of those two pieces. Some of the other tensions in the community that are just worth pointing out, because Emmy and I will try to touch on these as we go through further episodes in the future, are things like the transition from the three founders of B Lab, to more of a global governance structure, and the challenges with any company of having a founder transition. That's just hard for anyone. And in the B Corp world, it's been hard as well, because the center of the B Corp world was in the US and Philly. And then now there's B Lab US and Canada, which is a separate entity. And now there's B Lab Global, which is like the more global governance. So we'll be talking about the different regional components and some of the tension. The other two things I'd say is, one is just the backlog and challenges of getting certified and just recertified. That, COVID happened. If folks weren't tracking this, during COVID, the amount of applications for B Corp certification went way up. I think I'd heard at one point it was like 60% higher than they were the previous year. And then B Lab staff were dealing with COVID and had their lives disrupted. And so you basically had a gigantic, and Emmy, you were working at B Lab, so you could probably speak to this better, but had a giant sort of cluster F of things happening, which led to like a huge queue and, a lot of challenges with just getting companies simply certified on a reasonable timeline. Maybe I'll just point to the last thing, the last big tension, I think, is around one of the other, I guess maybe this is subsumed in the previous point, but I know that B Lab has been experimenting with third-party folks to help move the queue forward. And so like having third-party companies like do some of the certifying and recertifying of companies. And that's been up and down experience for a lot of folks. And I think the last thing is just transparency from B Lab and just like what's going on. I think there's been a lot of critique of B Lab and not like any one person or group, but just like what is going on and like who's leading the ship. And like, if I email you and give feedback, like who is responding and what's the appropriate response time. So I think there's just been a lot of feeling that connection that a lot of folks had with some of the previous iterations of B Lab staff has been more, it's like they don't really know who's leading the ship anymore. And so that's been, I think, stressful for a lot of existing B Corps. Sorry, Emmy, what do you think? Anything I missed? Anything you want to double click on?
I was going to say, I think you put all of that together quite eloquently. I don't have any other thoughts than that.
Yeah. Did you want to add any commentary on what it was like during COVID trying to deal with?
Woof. We could have a whole episode. I think the tension around this version of the B Lab network, so it's both B Lab Global and then what they call global partners, B Lab Global Partners. Yeah, and during the pandemic, it really was truly just the worst of all factors combined together. It was an increased demand for new certification. B Lab had given extensions to much of the community during the thick of 2020 events. So that sort of pushed a lot of research later and also to the time with a bunch of new certifications. The pathways to sort of quote post-certification for recertification and initial certification weren't like formally defined during that time. And then B Lab Global, B Lab US and Canada was actively separating from B Lab Global. This is like 2021, all 2021. The leader of B Lab US and Canada stepped down. The leaders and founders of the movement at B Lab Global were stepping down. A whole new set of leadership came in that weren't necessarily super familiar or had sort of like formal experience in the B Corp movement. It just really was not a great time to be there, and is reflected in a lot of the turnover that happened, including yours truly. But the pandemic was a really interesting inflection point for sure for the movement.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure how much more in depth to go into any of the topics, considering this is episode 1, sort of like an overview.
Mm-hmm.
But I just wanted to reiterate that we'd really love for folks to write in and give us thoughts or questions or requests for what you'd like us to speak on. So you can go to beyond@lifteconomy.com. And if you want to check out our other podcast, it's called Next Economy Now. It's on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or iTunes.
It's pretty cool.
It's pretty cool. And Spotify, all the things. We've had that podcast since 2015, so 9 years. Wow, it's a long time. So Emmy and I are excited because honestly, we talk about these things with each other all the time. And so this is sort of publicly airing some of the conversations we already have, which is usually the best podcasts, honestly, because it means other people are also thinking about it.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to know, again, to keep really in context, a lot of our criticisms in this podcast, a lot of our feedback in this podcast is with an eye towards the future, which is a B Corp movement that is effective and inclusive and regenerative. And I do think it's helpful to sort of identify some of the trends that folks are saying throughout the community. We talked to a lot of different stakeholders in the B Corp community and around the B Corp community, but the idea really is to, yes, have a safe space to have these conversations and to enable a better B Corp movement for everyone.
Yes, we are both trying to keep a positive eye towards where do we hope the B Corp movement can go, and also not overly protecting B Lab or some of the companies in order to like make sure everyone feels nice and warm and fuzzy. This is like, we might have difficult conversations. We will have difficult conversations.
Yeah, and I guess I should also say, I meant to say, I think the Lyft economy body of work is somewhat uniquely positioned to have these conversations simply because the Lyft economy team has very much talked about these tensions for many years now. I would argue since almost the very, very beginning of understanding that where we're at is not an economy for the benefit of all life. This is not an economy that serves people or planet. It's not locally minded. And we serve at Lyft Economy what we call next economy organizations. We support folks in enabling organizations that are regenerative and inclusive and equitable and locally minded. I think it's really wonderful to ideate and envision the economy that actually serves all of us. And I do think that B Corps can get there. Some of them are there, some of them are getting there. But yeah, I think it's really important as we have these conversations that are critical and constructive that a better world is possible. And I think we all know that in the B Corp movement, but I do think we need some reminders every once in a while. So I'm hoping to, in this podcast, like as we have these conversations that are sort of shedding a light on some of the less talked about and less transparent parts of the movement, that we're always having an eye toward a future that's better for all of us.
Yeah, well said. I am excited about that too, to bring some of that next economy framing. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for, are we doing enough in the B Corp world, and how do we create a more equitable and regenerative and racially just economy? So great. Well, thanks everyone for listening to our first episode.
Yeah.
So check it out, lifteconomy.com, and you can subscribe on wherever you get your podcasts. And so thanks so much for listening.
Yeah, thanks. Beyond the B is a production of Lyft Economy. To listen to all of our past episodes, you can visit lifteconomy.com/beyond. Please take a moment to rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening.